So we're in Louisville, and there's four of us. We're going to the airport, and a guy had brought his car, so he was driving. And it was like a, I don't know, 2012 Buick or Pontiac, an older style car, but it had navigation in it and GPS. And we're driving. It's only like 6 minutes to this airport. And we keep going around like this 4-block square, and we keep taking a left, and we keep taking a left. And I'm seeing the same thing over and over and over. And I'm wondering what we're doing. And finally I said, let's go straight here. Welcome to our podcast, Digital Forensic Redefined. I'm Rob Walensky. I'll be your host, and joining us again is Kevin Croninger, the Monroe County District Attorney from Wisconsin. Well, previously we've talked about a couple of different subjects, and one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about was, and I'm guessing you've ran into these too, but I refer to them kind of as technologically disadvantaged individuals. And I mean, you might even be one of those, or maybe worse.
I was going to say, when I look in the mirror, I see one most days when I try to turn my toothbrush on that now connects to Bluetooth and the internet and I don't know, probably some tracking agency. I don't know.
Yeah, you got to have a phone app to brush your teeth.
Yeah, and it reminds me when I don't do it right too.
That's why they have those breath mints, because you get tired of messing with the phone.
Did I not do good this morning? I don't.
So, and what I mean by that is, obviously, some people associate it with the older generation. I don't know that that's always the case, because I might qualify as the older generation or getting there. So, I like to think I'm at least competent, but, the younger generation, the 20-somethings, they've basically grown up with it since birth. I mean, we have kids that have iPads that haven't started kindergarten yet and things like that. So, and then there's normal people. They could use their cell phone, and they might be able to use, they might be able to use their remote control. But,
those are complicated sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. So what is your experience? I mean, you must see the gamut. I mean, with your jurors and different employees and things when things come up.
So a couple of things I would say. I think first with jurors, it's always hard to tell, because even in voir dire, when you're talking to them, it's hard sometimes to elicit and get a full grasp of what their knowledge is. So when I'm presenting stuff to a jury, when I'm having an expert testify about it, I think you have to play to the lowest common denominator, right? Which is just assume everybody there doesn't know how to turn their TV on. And I think sometimes I annoy jurors with that, but I think there's always probably one there who appreciates the full explanation. And then as far as with professionals, I think the same is true as well, right? I mean, we have people in the defense bar, we have people in law enforcement, we have people who sort of just want to refuse that to believe that technology exists, right? And I think we've talked about this before too. In life, we can just refuse to accept things that are, or we can accept them and work with them, right? And so I think that's true of technology. I think that's true of digital forensics. Is you need to be willing to embrace it. And so we see a lot of different things, right? I have defense attorneys who I practice with who I think are really intelligent on the issues, really up to date on the issues, who frankly at times I've learned from. And then we have some who I think they know a lot, who don't.
But we all know those type of people. I mean, we may not consider ourselves.
Yes, they're called attorneys.
You said it. Prosecutors specifically.
Well, no. Well, I mean, it's that's an issue that is across the board for attorneys. Okay. I think we tend to have egos occasionally.
Egos and a lot of words.
Yeah, it's good. It takes a lot to explain how awesome we are.
So we're in Louisville, and there's four of us. We're going to the airport, and a guy had brought his car, so he was driving. And it was like a, I don't know, 2012 Buick or Pontiac, an older style car, but it had navigation in it and GPS. And we're driving. It's only like 6 minutes to this airport. And we keep going around like this 4-block square, and we keep taking a left, and we keep taking a left. And I'm seeing the same thing over and over and over. And I'm wondering what we're doing. And finally I said, let's go straight here. He's like, oh, okay. Well, come to find out, he had talked about this car. It had like 200,000 miles on it, and he was just proud of it. Bought it brand new, and it was in good shape for an older vehicle. And it had all this technology supposedly. Still had the clock with the hands on it though, and
that's a challenge now. Most people don't even know how to read those anymore. Probably.
Well, anyway, I don't think the GPS in this car had obviously not been updated or renewed or whatever since probably the year it was made, and unfortunately, Louisville upgraded, and there was a few new roads and stuff, and it happened to be our trip to the airport. We needed to go straight instead of left all the time. So, I guess back to the point, we deal with these people, and you said you kind of got to cater to, the lowest common denominator as far as, their knowledge of this stuff. Most people, I think, when they think of technology, we're talking about a TV or we're talking about a cell phone. That's technology to them. That's what they deal with every day. Maybe their vehicle nowadays with the navigation systems and stuff. But so how do you determine? How do you explain it to people? I mean, how do you present this?
So what I look for when I talk about somebody I'm going to have testify or when I'm talking to an expert is somebody who can translate for me, right? In my job, I handle such a wide variety of types of cases that, one day I can be dealing with an animal abuse case, the next day a child abuse case, the next day a child sexual assault case, and then a homicide, and then a drug case, and then a financial crime. And all of these areas have people who are experts, right, and know a lot more about this than I do. So I look for people who I can make that translation for me, who can make me understand, because frankly, sometimes I feel like if my dumb ass can understand it, anyone can understand it. So I think that, keeping that in mind. And then also, I think it's important if you know people who are technologically inept, if you're going to present evidence to a jury, if you have someone in your family, I don't want to call anyone out in my family, but there's some people I'll call up and be like, hey, why don't we just talk about, unallocated space on a computer and see, how that goes over and if they kind of get that. So, it's not an easy thing to do. And I think two things I take from your story. One is being mindful of the fact that there's people with different levels. And two is don't just follow the technology because the technology says so, if that makes sense, right? Like in this situation, you still got to use common sense, right?
But how many times have you had your navigation up on your brand new Android or iPhone and thought it was crazy and went a different direction and got lost and should have followed your iPhone?
Sure. Yeah. But when it's so abundantly obviously wrong, right? When you're driving in circles, or I was in the vehicle with a family member not too long ago and, it's telling us to go away and I can look ahead and see that the road is closed. Right? So trust but verify. It's like anything in life, right? Like the information is important and you want to look at that. I'm not saying just think right? There's a balance there, right? Like don't just think you know best and say, screw the GPS. I've done that plenty of times in my life.
I always know best.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought too. And then that's how you end up spending a couple hours in park on the interstate. That's happened before. Because the GPS said get off. I'm like, why would I get off here? This doesn't make any sense.
When you finally say the hell with it and dig the atlas out of the trunk.
Yeah. Well, when you're in park, there's not much you can do anyway. So just listen to a good podcast or put some interesting guys on there. So, but I think, really it's just being mindful of that. At the end of the day, all of what we do is interacting with people, right? If you're a defense attorney, if you're a prosecutor, if you're a cop, you have to interact with people and you kind of have to win them over. And to win someone over, you have to understand where they're coming from. And I think I've said this before about technology, accepting the technology, accepting also where people are coming from, right? And that means some people are more intelligent or more well-versed on the technology than you. And some people, are way, way over here, not well-versed on it.
I know sometimes, and more often than not, I think we try to use like demonstrative things, tangible things that we could actually show. Even if it's some technical data from a phone or whatever, important things we try to put into visual aids where somebody can actually read the text messages up on a screen, like in your courtrooms. I know we can display these as somebody's testifying to them. And if we're talking about, the date and time stamps or the metadata for, the technical terms for images and things like that, we can display that. So they're actually seeing what it is we're talking about at kind of at the same time. So you're educating them using their visual sense instead of talking about metadata and unallocated space on computers and things like that. So I think that's helpful, and I think we've gotten pretty good in some of our cases at doing that.
Yeah, and certainly not with present company, but some experts are pretty boring when you put them up there. They're just talking and talking and talking and talking and about stuff that no one seems to care about or that they don't understand. And so having visual aids that kind of help the process along, I think is really helpful. Some of that too is just in when you're picking your expert. I mean, you don't want somebody who's a goofball on the stand, but you also don't want somebody who just drones on and on and on forever.
Well, yeah, so. It becomes it's almost blends. It just blends into everything. Blends into the next thing, and it's really hard to sit there for hours and listen to somebody talk about something that you've checked out on, as a juror or whatever. You check out. You only can focus on something that you may not be interested in or may not seem important to you for so long.
Yeah, and some of that's an advocacy thing. As a trial attorney, you have to be able to do certain things to cue the jury in that this is important, right? And so there's things we do with our voices, changing tone, changing volume, just directly saying, this is really important, stuff like that we do sometimes, but it's also, knowing the evidence, and to be able to do that, you have to know what's important as the prosecutor or the defense attorney, and then having some discussion or at least understanding with your expert that they can explain those things that are important. So.
Yeah. And maybe this is more of a lawyer thing or whatever, but I've noticed a lot of the cases where I've testified, especially, most of our cases, a lot of times my testimony as the expert, by the time it gets to a jury, isn't highly technical discussions. We've already had those. There's already been the motion hearings and things like that. Now we're presenting, the meat and potatoes of it, I guess, what the messages say, or what time they were sent, or whose phone we found them on, and how do we know it's their phone, and, those type of things. So,
yeah, and I think for me, part of the reason, at least maybe that's been your experience with me, is I try to, kind of blend those worlds together. Like what can I get into evidence and make this as simple as possible for the jury, right? So a lot of times it is pretty dumbed down, and that's not to be insulting to the jurors, but some of it is I just understand limited attention span, right? Like I can't sit anywhere for 10 minutes and listen to anyone talk, even if it's the most interesting thing in the world, probably, maybe longer than 10 minutes, but an hour, no. And so, part of that is that's a trial strategy too, is, okay, what's important, focus the jury's attention on that. But once again, you got to talk to your expert to be able to do that. If you don't have that good relationship, like you and I have had on cases to have that discussion, how am I going to be able to focus that in? And am I going to be able to do it in a way that makes any sense to the jury if you and I haven't talked about it?
Sure. And sometimes, I think one of our most recent homicide trials, I basically said yes and or no, for 4 or 5 hours.
Excellent questioning by that attorney. Who was that?
I don't know.
Who was that attorney questioning you in that case?
I don't know who that was.
What a hell of an attorney, yeah.
Literally my responses were yes or no. Yes, this was on the device. It happened to be recordings, I think. And then I would say, yes, I found this on the defendant's phone. And then you would play a segment of it. And then, we moved into some other area, or there was some segment that wasn't allowed to be played, so we'd skip that. And then you'd say, well, this next segment, because we had a transcript, yes, I got that on the defendant's phone, and then we'd play it so they could actually hear the defendant speaking in the recordings, whether it was an interview or from a phone or whatever it was. But so it was really at that point a lot of the work, the expert stuff that we do had already been done. So
yeah, and I think depending on where you practice, it may not always be the case, but where I practice, at least I'm not going to say we have a great relationship with the defense bar, but there's a respectful one in the sense that we can have these discussions beforehand. And I would encourage anyone who's practicing taking this stuff to trial, if you're presenting this, to have a conversation with opposing counsel and say, hey, here's what I want to present. I think a lot of times people want to hold tight to their case, but I don't, in most situations, I don't know that there's a lot of value to that. Yeah. And see if you can just get past some of those issues. Because for both sides, we should want the truth to come out. And to do that, having an objection where we have to send the jury out to every single piece of digital evidence is annoying, it's unproductive, and it doesn't allow the jury to actually view the facts. And so that's an important part of presenting digital evidence, is not only understanding what's important, how to ask the questions about it, but then also having discussions about how you're going to get it in. And if the defense or the prosecution won't agree to it, I would suggest that you should have that motion beforehand with the judge. I mean, this, to my mind, is basic practice of trial as an attorney, but sometimes we have to say the simple things out loud.
Right. And sometimes the better attorneys, I guess, the better defense attorneys, I'll refer to them as, they recognize this stuff prior to all of a sudden the aha moments in the middle of a trial. They're already aware of issues they want brought up, and they're dealt with a lot before then. I mean, we had a insane motion hearing in a homicide case. I think we had to come back 3 different days. This thing went on and on and on. Well, then when it comes to trial, that's already been litigated. Everybody knows where it's at, and nobody's sitting there looking, shocked that this came up. So
yeah, and that's really important, and frankly important to both sides, right? I mean, if you're a prosecutor and you're not bringing those issues to the forefront prior to a trial, it's not going to go well for you at trial, or it's not going to go well for you on appeal potentially. We'd rather just get those issues litigated. And if you're a defense attorney, I don't know how you can claim you're doing your job for your client if there's issues that need to be litigated and you're not litigating them. It's part of the deal. Now, I don't believe in over litigation, and there's some defense attorneys who file too many motions or ask for too many hearings. But there's also an obligation, and I understand that for a defense attorney to file some motions and to challenge certain things and to say the state can't do that kind of stuff. So
right, yeah. I mean, you always seem to know after you work with enough attorneys and are in the process, the attorneys or the ones that you're going to have those issues with. And a lot of times I think we find ourselves, more so but you almost prepare that it's going to be a last minute issue, or it's going to come up during the trial, and you want to address it because you need a record, and you don't want, the different.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to a question I get a lot is like, well, aren't you happy when the defense attorney's terrible? And I'm like, no, it makes my life miserable because I want to do justice, and I think I have an obligation to do justice. And part of justice is having the defendant have an advocate who knows what they're doing. Right. And so when they don't have an advocate who knows what they're doing, I feel like I have an obligation to not necessarily defend, but to not push so hard that it looks like, or that I am actually running afoul of the rules. Whereas if the other side is pushing back, it kind of evens that out, and I can pretty much push as hard as I want to, because if I do step just over bounds, they're going to push me back in.
Right. And sometimes you almost feel like you're doing some of their work for them, because that this is an issue, they need to be aware of it, or it's going to come back later to be dealt with.
Yeah, and I think in digital forensics, that's a big thing we see now, is because there's some, as I think we talked about earlier, some people who just sort of refuse to accept the fact that this is reality, but it is. And so it's reality. We all have to deal with it, and to do our jobs, we have to, understand, at least at some level, or understand who to ask the right questions to.
Thanks for joining our podcast this week, brought to you by Defense Forensic, where we find the truth in data.
And before you go, please make sure to click that subscribe button and post any comments you may have about this week's episode below. Also, check out our website at defenseforensic.com for more information on the services available for individuals and organizations that require expert analysis of digital evidence.
And once again, thanks for watching, and join us next week for a new episode. And remember, the truth is out there.